Are you struggling to get into the housing market? Maybe you don't have enough for a down payment, or the banks keep saying no. Well, today's episode is for you. I'm sitting down with David Pereira, founder of Rent to Grow Homes, a specialized rent-to-own program helping renters become homeowners in Southwestern Ontario. We'll break down how rent-to-own works, who it benefits, and how it can be a game changer for both homebuyers and investors. If you're looking for a creative way to buy a home, build your credit, or grow your real estate portfolio, this episode is packed with insights you won't want to miss. Hello, and thank you for tuning into Business and Beyond. My name is Brian Braga, and I am your host. And today we are joined by David Pereira, a real estate investor and the founder of Rent to Grow Homes, which is the best rent-to-own program that I have ever seen. David, how are you doing today?
Hey, Brian, I appreciate the intro, the warm intro, and the praise. And I'm looking forward to doing a deep dive into the program to help justify your high claim for it.
So what inspired you to start Rent to Grow, and how did your journey as an investor lead you to this program?
Sure. So my wife and I started investing over 10 years ago, 2013. And we invested in a triplex in Hamilton. And the realtor we worked with, his name is Mark Loeffler. He actually wrote a book on rent to own. And so I read it back in the day, back in 2013, and I love the concept of win-win. Right. I love the idea of putting my money into a cause that helps a family helps a family earn home ownership. And it just made a ton of sense to me. But of course, I just didn't take action. And for years, I did not take any action. My wife and I had done some more investments and duplexes and condos. We're small time, but we were comfortable kind of at our pace. And then over COVID, a good friend of mine and I, we'd known each other for 15 years. We talked over COVID, realized we were both into real estate. And we looked for sort of a vehicle that would make sense for both of us, that we both liked. And one day I heard this woman talking about rent to own on a podcast. And I called her up later that night and kind of had sort of that intake interview. And within a few months, we were investors in a deal. And again, I just love the win-win. As an investor, it was probably the easiest real estate profit I've made, in the sense that it was very hands-off. I didn't do any of the tenant management. I didn't do any of the property management. It literally was cutting the check up front. And I went to the inspection because I wanted to see the house. Aside from that, I never had to visit it. And so as an investor, I really liked it. And a few months later, I was kind of thinking to myself, like, why don't I become an operator? I love the model. I know enough about real estate now. So I ended up actually hiring a coach who is an expert at this stuff. And it was referred to me by someone who I trusted. This coach had done a ton of real estate deals, ton of rent-to-own deals. And she was able to really sort of fill in the gaps. All the things that I didn't know, all those things that could happen, all the worst case scenarios. We were able to talk through that stuff. And she gave me some really concrete answers on, her name's Elizabeth Kelly, and she was able to really sort of fill those gaps for me. And so then I got contracts created, process, mapped out, here's how things work, and then launched really in late 2022, with a focus in smaller communities. And so we looked at Cornwall, Ontario. Recently, we've been looking at Kitchener, Waterloo, Cambridge, that area, Windsor, Niagara Falls. So it works in areas where cash flow is possible for the investor. It doesn't work in the GTA. It just doesn't work in Toronto because the home prices are so high, the rents, it's just impossible to cash flow. So the model does not work. But in the Tri-Cities area, in Cornwall, we've seen success, and it's been really rewarding. It's honestly something I really enjoy because the gratitude from the tenant buyer in terms of, hey, they see a path now to owning their own house. The investor's really happy because they sit back, kick up their feet, and they're collecting monthly cash flow, which is the dream of any real estate investor. And so to be in the middle and sort of make things happen is really
nice.
Rewarding
and
for me.
Is such a good explanation of how you found rent to own and how you've grown into it to make it your own. Would you be able to break down how the Rent to Grow program works and how it's a win-win for both tenants and investors?
Sure. So let's start with the tenant buyers. So a tenant buyer, the definition is someone who's going to be a renter for the kind of the first period. And then at the end of that period, they're going to buy the house from the investor. So step one really is getting qualified. And so what that means is typically a broker like yourself, a realtor, or someone comes across one of my ads, they reach out to me and we have an initial conversation. In that conversation, I'm going to ask some preliminary questions about their numbers, but I'm also going to try and understand their motivation. Like why are they looking at rent to own? What are they hoping to achieve? And just get a sense of them as individuals. Assuming everything kind of works from there, then I will connect them to my broker. And my broker will do sort of the same type of analysis, financial analysis that Brian, you would do, right? Or any mortgage broker would do to gauge their kind of their worthiness of qualification. Now, what we're not worried necessarily about qualifying today. Really, what we're trying to project is what is the profile going to look like in 2 or 3 years when this tenant buyer is going to qualify for themselves for a bank mortgage. Right now, what I'm looking for is, do they have good incomes? If they have bad credit, well, what's the reason for the bad credit? Was it a one-off accident? Is there like a long sort of history of really poor decisions? If they don't have enough savings for a down payment, well, what's the reason? And to work with us, you need to have at least a down payment of 10,000 or typically 2% of the purchase property. The reason I insist on that is I need to know you're capable of saving. If I don't do zero down, because I know with zero down, there's no skin in the game for the tenant buyer. And if you're not able to save at least 10K, like you probably should not be in home ownership. So it's really kind of a filter. So let's assume my broker approves that. What he'll do is basically provide the tenant buyer with a budget. So let's assume we're operating in Kitchener-Waterloo. Let's assume the budget is 500,000. So you've been approved for 500,000. You're now going to work with your realtor and you're going to go through the normal home buying process. You're going to find a house, but the max we can offer on that house is 500,000. If you find something that's 450, great. But 500 is the most we can offer. Now, in terms of who picks the house, it is the tenant buyer. So the tenant buyer does the normal home buying shopping. They get to sort of see themselves in the house. They get to like work with the realtor, get all the daily emails of new properties in their area. So it's that experience is very much like a normal home buying process. Once the tenant buyer is excited by a house, the realtor gets in touch with me. I've connected them to an investor who's going to basically buy the house for them. So this investor is going to sign the paperwork. They've already been pre-qualified. They can handle a purchase of 500,000. So we then put in an offer conditional upon inspection. The reason we want to have an inspection is because we want to make sure we're buying a good house, right? We don't want major issues like plumbing, foundation, roof. Like none of us want major expenses in the next 5 years. And so the inspector provides us that with a long 40-page report. I go through it, the investor goes through it, and the tenant buyer goes through it. And if any of us are uncomfortable, we move on. So no one feels obligated to move forward with a purchase if they don't feel happy with it. Let's assume we're happy with it. Then what happens is we basically do the closing with a lawyer. So it's a normal home buying process. And the tenant buyer moves in on day one. Now, up front, the tenant buyer has sort of paid that deposit I mentioned of 10,000 or 2% of the house, and they've paid for the inspection fee. But aside from that, there's no other fees. And what they're going to do each month is pay slightly below market rent. So I would work with a realtor to kind of and look at sort of the data on Facebook Marketplace to get a sense what is fair market rent there. And typically, I'll discount the rent by $100 or $150. And on the first of the month, they pay that rent. On the 15th of the month, they pay this thing called the option credit. And the option credit is how we help them save for their future down payment. So just to use an example here, if the house is 500,000, we've already preset the price that the tenant buyer is going to buy the house back at from the investor. So we generally assume the market's going to go up 5% per year. So for a 3-year deal, it's about 575,000. So if I'm the tenant buyer and in 3 years, I need to qualify to be able to purchase my own house at 575, well, I know that I'm going to do 5% down. I'm going to need closing costs. I'm going to need land transfer tax. It's going to be about $35,000, give or take. So I need to get to $35,000 savings. I already started with $10,000 deposit. That gap is $25,000. So we just divide $25,000 by 36 months. It works out to about $700. So each month, the tenant buyer is paying that below market rent. And on the 15th of the month, they pay that additional $700. And over 36 months, they have now saved a total of $25,000. We add that original $10,000 deposit. They now have $35,000 sitting there to use for their down payment, which allows them to now buy the house back from the investor.
Nice. That's such a great model.
Yeah, so it's really rent to own. You can think of it as a bridge of time, right? So a lot of the people that I speak to, a lot of the young tenant buyers I speak to, They have good jobs, right? So you and I have talked to a couple of young tenant buyers where the combined incomes are 120,000, 140, 160. They don't have enough, they just haven't had enough time to save, and they sometimes they don't have enough time to build their credit, right? So they just need time to build credit. They need time to save more money. But if they did it on their own and they just sort of on their own saved, they're worried that the market's going to take off. So a house today that might be in Kitchener for 500K, well, in 2 years' time, who knows what happens with immigration still kind of persistent, slow housing builds. Trump's tariffs could slow down new builds, which actually then will drive diminish supply. So they're worried that, hey, the market may take off on us and we never are going to be able to buy a home. Like that's literally the conversations I've had with people who are 24, 25, 26 years old. And they're really worried about just not being able to afford ever. So the benefit of rent to own to them is that it gives them stability and it gives them predictability. So the stability part is the rent is not going to change over the 3-year period. So their rent stays the same. It doesn't go up 2% per year. What we do on day one is their consistent rent for 3 years. They don't have to worry about a landlord selling, right? So this is a very common thing in Ontario because landlords want to sell their place. They want to cash out on their investment. So they serve an N12 to the tenant buyer or to the tenants saying, hey, you're going to have to move out. And it's really stressful for tenants, right? Because they now have to displace their family and move somewhere else. So in our program, none of that happens, right? Like the investor is basically contractually obligated to not sell the place, and if they have to sell the place, well, the tenant buyer is the first person who can buy it. So none of that stress occurs. And then at the end of 3 years, like I said, the predictability part, they know exactly what the purchase price is. So we started 500K. In 3 years, we're saying 575. And if the market is 650, it's still 575. And the tenant buyer gets to kind of pocket that extra equity. It really is sort of predicated on sticking to a plan, on sort of breaking a big down payment into like these monthly slices that are affordable, and just continuously just working at it. And at the end of 3 years, all of a sudden, the tenant buyer's got this big lump of money saved, and now they're actually in a position to get approved.
I love that you add an aspect of forced savings every month, because just having that obligation to pay every month going towards your down payment, you know where it's going, you know it's not going anywhere, you're not even tempted to touch it. You're kind of taking away that option for you to even spend that money, and you're forcing yourself to save that down payment, which is very good. If you're ever in a case where, let's say, they don't have $700 a month to be at $2,500 at the end of the 3 years, would you negotiate lower with the payments?
So we could negotiate lower, but so really we let the math dictate what the numbers should be, right? Because ultimately my job is to set them up for success to get a mortgage at the end of 3 years. So we make assumptions. Oh, we know what the home price is going to be. And if you're going to be 5% down, we can go onto the internet to get what the land transfer tax is going to be. We assume what legal closing is going to be 22,000 or 2,500, so that we know from the math how much down payment you're going to need to have, right? And as you just said, the forced savings make sure that the money is going to be there. Because if we didn't collect it, hey, life happens, expenses happen, and this could get pushed down to the bottom of the priority list. And all of a sudden we arrive at the end of 3 years and we haven't saved anything, or we've saved 5K and we're 20K short. So this really, I'll try and be somewhat lenient if I can, but really like the goal is to make sure all the money is there. And the other thing is it gets young families or young couples used to the bank withdrawing money every month from your account for mortgages. Like the bank is not going to negotiate the monthly payment, right? Like once you can negotiate your interest rate and then that dictates your monthly, but that's it. Like then you're paying that and it's coming out of your account every month. It's not a choice to pay it. It's coming out of your account every month. So we try and do it similarly to make sure people are prepared for getting their own mortgage, because that's the way the banks are.
And I know you mentioned 2-year, 3-year terms. Like, is that just on average what you offer, or do you offer longer or shorter terms?
So our average deal is typically 3 years. The average term length is 3 years. Where we've started seeing some 2 years lately is really for newer Canadians who are still trying to achieve their PR status. So if you are a newer Canadian, you're working, you've got good income, you've got credit, like decent credit, and even some good savings. The problem is if you try and buy a house today, the rules in Ontario are such that if you don't have your permanent resident status, you have to pay the non-residential speculation tax, the NRST. And it literally is a 25% tax you have to pay on the purchase price, and it's due at closing. So just to do the math for a second, if we approved you for $500,000 in Kitchener and you have to pay this 25% tax, you literally have to cut a check for $125,000. A lot of people don't have that money available. Now, so it's kind of weird. If you go to the Ontario government website, you don't get certainty on whether you'll get that money back. It's almost like you may get that money back or you may get a portion back. So I actually don't know how it plays out once you do that. So it's really kind of unnerving for new Canadians who were brought here. They're working, they have great jobs, they're contributing to kind of Canada's GDP. They're doing everything they're supposed to do, but they're being handcuffed at getting their own house. So rent to own is kind of an alternative to that. We do 2-year deals with people who are in the process of getting their PR status. And once they get their PR status, they can exit early or they can just wait till the end of the 2-year term. I don't do 1-year terms because it just doesn't make sense from an investor standpoint. There's too many sort of upfront costs. So no investor is going to sign up for a 1-year term. So 2 years is my minimum. But we've been starting to see a lot of new Canadians taking advantage of this program as a way to legally circumvent.
Are there any
NRST.
penalties to breaking early if that's the case?
So if they want to close early, the only penalty really is whatever the bank will charge the investor for breaking the mortgage, right? So if we had signed up for a 2-year term, then my investor is going to get a 2-year fixed mortgage, right? Because those are the best rates we're going to get. So we always sort of match the mortgage length the investor gets to the desire of the tenant buyer. If they want 2 years, no problem. We'll get a 2-year mortgage. Now, if we need to break that mortgage at the 14-month mark or 16-month mark, the bank is always going to charge a penalty. And so what we do is we just simply say, hey, we're going to pass that penalty charge to the tenant buyer if they want to break early. And I think we charge an admin fee as well, just because there's a fair bit of process work to be done. But aside from that, there's nothing really extra. So it is possible. And I'm actually working with someone now who got their PR status month 14. And so we're just talking to RBC now to figure out what is the breakage fee and whether it's worth it.
That really adds on to when you're paying a mortgage, and if you're breaking early, paying that penalty as well. Like, it's really just good practice for what you're going to be facing as a homeowner even. How do you help tenants build credit and their financial stability while in this program?
Sure. Yeah. So one thing I've done is partnered with this guy called his name is Richard Moxley. He literally wrote a book on credit. And his website, I think, is called The Credit Game. And I remember reading this book a few months ago and I was shocked because my credit's in decent shape, but there's a ton of stuff I did not know in terms of credit card usage and the way that Equifax and TransUnion looks at things. So as part of the service that is paid for, like there's no extra charge from our tenant buyers we work with. On day one, I connect them to Richard and he actually will interview them. He'll look at their credit scores and credit reports and he puts together a plan. And he'll basically say, look, for you to get, our goal is for our tenant buyers to have a credit score of over 700 by the time they want to qualify for their own mortgage. Brian, you know, as a mortgage broker, like my job is to make sure that you love my tenant buyers. You see a profile that's got 5% savings. It's clear they got some extra money stowed away for legal, for land transfer. You know where the money's coming from. They've got great credit. Like, I'm trying to satisfy you because ultimately they're going to work with you or whoever their broker is to close the deal. So I know that they're going to get favorable rates in 3 years if their credit score is over 700. The good news is, even if your credit score is 500 today, 3 years is plenty of time to repair your credit. So what we do is first we put a plan together saying you're going to need to do this with your credit cards. You're going to need to maybe apply for a new card, keep your limits to this, only spend this much. So we're very, very particular on those rules. Then every 6 months, you're going to meet with Richard or someone from his team, and you're going to give him your pay stubs, tax returns, your updated credit reports. He's going to analyze it and he's going to provide feedback. He's also going to let me know that things are on track. So again, this thing's all about predictability. And what I want to know is your credit score rising the way it should be? And if it is, then great. If it's not, and Richard tells me, hey, you know what? They bought a truck that they shouldn't have brought, or they spent money that they shouldn't have, or they took a new loan. well, that's a red flag for me, right? And so then I have to have a conversation with them to say, hey, what happened, what led to this, and then we try and fix it. Right? So part of the purpose is to just make sure there's these checks and balances along the way, so that our tenant buyer knows there's accountability. We're not just leaving you own for your 3 years and hoping you figure it out. We guide you along the way with checks every 6 months on the finances to make sure
Nice.
you're
And
on the
that's
right
another
track.
reason why I really believe in this program. Like, you're really taking tenants who are in need of housing, you're teaching them how to be financially stable, how to get good credit. You're setting them up for success. Like, I really, really believe in this program for getting people into their first homes. But switching gears a bit, going on to the investor perspective, like, what's the benefit of being an investor for a rent to grow home?
Sure. So my typical investor is a normal family. Like I don't work with institutional investors. I'm not working with like family trusts or foundations. It's like, literally I have like my neighbor 3 doors down is an investor. And he heard about it because he probably I think we were walking our dogs one day. He asked me kind of what I was doing and I told him about it. And he was like, "Oh, that's really interesting. I've got some money saved in my HELOC or I've got some money saved and I'd be interested in this." And what appeals to him is he has no interest in property management. He has no interest in tenant management. His thing is, hey, David, here's some money. I'd love to have some monthly cash flow. And at the end of 3 years, I want more money back. And that's really what he's in for. He doesn't want to deal with any of the details of being a landlord. So basically, our promise to, I can't say guarantee, but our promise to our investors is that over the course of 3 years, you will get 20% targeted 20% annual return, which is 60% total. So just doing quick math here, let's assume all in the very beginning, you're in for 100,000. The 100,000 is basically to purchase the home at a 20% normal, 20% down. So it's a normal investor mortgage from a tier A bank. If you're in for 100K, at the end of 3 years, you will have received 160,000. $60,000 profit, which is 60K plus your original 100K back. And some of that 60K profit will come from monthly cash flow. So the cash flow each month, once I've covered all the mortgage, property tax, insurance, all that stuff, there's still on top of that cash flow that we give to our investor. And that ranges between 400 and 600 depending on the size of the deal, but they're getting cash flow. Any investor in Ontario right now will tell you cash flow is difficult. And especially to get that without having to take care of tenants or worry about phone calls that my toilet's plugged, there's none of that stuff. And the reason is because I'm in the middle, sort of taking care of the details. The other reason this works out is because we have motivated tenant buyers and they are invested in taking care of their house. They want to live in a great home. One thing that they do is they take care of their house. So they are responsible for maintenance. They're responsible for taking care of the snow, cutting the grass. They are effectively homeowners. They act like homeowners. That's part of the reason we give them a discount on the rent. But it's a very different structure. But our tenant buyers love it because they get to treat the home like their own. If they want to paint the walls, if they want to put in a fence, they want to do something with the deck, they run it by me. And 99% of the time, I'll say yes. As long as it does not hurt the house, doesn't hurt the value of the home, they can do as they wish with the house. And they love that because it gives them freedom that they would not have had in a typical rental
Yeah,
that they would
wow,
have
that's
lived in.
awesome, and that's so appealing from an investment perspective too. To just put your money in, get some dividends from it, and then at the end with a gain too. In the sense where like something breaks down, so you need new appliances, things like that. That falls on the tenant.
Yeah, it does. And so this is why, well, this is also why we do the inspection up front, right? So, and the tenant buyer gets to look at all that stuff. And they'll know, like I would have talked to them several times before they sign anything that, hey, when you do the inspection, look at the age of the appliances, look at the age of the roof. What we're trying to avoid is any major expenses in the next 3 to 5 years. Now, of course, if they need a new fridge, well, fine, they need a new fridge, and the tenant buyer was going to get that. But ultimately, they choose the fridge they want. If they want to get a deal from somewhere, they're allowed to. If they want to get brand new, it's within whatever they can handle within their budget. So, yeah, all those things are dealt with that. Now, let's assume the roof, something happens with the roof on year 2, and nothing in the inspection suggested this would happen, but something happens. And let's assume it's going to cost 15,000 to repair. There's a good chance the tenant buyer does not have 15K sitting there. So what we can do is we can have it go through the investor's insurance, or we can have the investor sort of front the $15,000 and then recoup that in the back end when we sell the house. So we just up the purchase price by 15K. So
Yeah.
there's ways around things like that, right? So again, my job is to make everything work, right? So everyone's happy at the very end if we have a successful conclusion where the tenant buyer buys the house from the investor. So really the goal is to knock down barriers that will prevent that from happening. That's my job. It's not to create barriers, it's to prevent them. And so what that means is if a problem comes up, my job is to problem solve. And so what I just described in terms of, hey, we've got options on how we deal with a busted roof, that's a scenario that we can work through because we've got options, and that's something that I take care of in the middle as sort of
Yeah,
the
and I
active
really like
manager.
how you mitigate risk up front by choosing like selectively choosing a good tenant buyer and really running through the risks there. How can a new investor get started with rent to own through your program if they wanted to get started?
So just really reach out to me, and we go through sort of a normal qualification process. What I'm looking, you work with a broker like yourself, Brian. What I want to know is how much can you qualify for, right? So what I'm interested in is, are there certain areas you care about? So are you
Mm.
interested in Kitchener, Waterloo, Cambridge? Would you prefer Eastern Ontario? Do you prefer Windsor? So you get a choice on region. Let me know what budget you're comfortable with. You may even have, hey, you know what? I'm an immigrant myself. I want to work with a new Canadian. I really am passionate about helping someone like that. So I've got some flexibility on, like, I'll ask you questions in terms of what would you like to invest in? And then as deals come up, if I've had a conversation, I know this deal would be perfect, I'll just send you the deal directly. Otherwise, I have an investor email list. I post on Facebook and all the usual social channels, Instagram, and that's how I share my deals. So it's really first come, first serve. Brian, the one that you connected me to a few weeks ago, that was snapped up, I think,
Nice.
within 3 hours of putting it out there. I got a bunch of responses. And so we're getting to the point now where I think people are they're probably getting tired of some degree of my social presence, but the message is getting across that, hey, this is a really good program that helps people and gives investors passive return. And so I'm starting to see a lot faster responses
Yeah,
now when I
and
put a deal out.
I'm actually on that emailing list as well. I saw it come to my email, and the rate of return on that investment too, absolutely insane. I was a bit baffled at how the return was, and you sent out a video as well that really explained the math clearly, explained all the risks, explained the situation as well as the couple, gave them like a minor introduction, and even being on the email list is huge. Like I'm very happy I'm on it, and if any investors want to get on that as well, it's a huge game changer if you're listening to this and you want to see what the investment could be of what you're putting in versus what you're getting out of it. Have you ever had a deal go wrong, and what lessons did you take away from it?
So I've had deals that haven't totally gone south. Actually, so before I did rent to own, I've had tenants that I've let into my properties that have gone bad. So I had a basement apartment in our first triplex in Hamilton, and apparently he was a drug dealer. And you discover that after the fact when the cops or the neighbors tell you this. One of the things I've learned in my 10 years as an investor is tenant screening is the most important thing I need to do well. And if I do that well, most of the other problems go away. So since I've done the rent to own program, I haven't really had any major issues because I've been so careful about the tenant screening. This program is not for everyone. It's really meant for people who have good incomes and ultimately will be able to get approved for a mortgage with their incomes. What I'm really helping with is the savings and the credit, and just helping them sort of get set up and structured so that they're in a position to win. But I can't help with income, right? So that really needs to come from the person, and the motivation needs to come from the person as well. So I haven't had major issues. I've had some couple times where someone was late with a option credit payment, but they let me know 2 weeks in advance. And I've said, hey, look, as long as you let me know proactively, I can work with you. One risk that I always tell my tenant buyers, it's highlighted in the contract, and I mention it probably 5 times before they sign anything, is the risk to them is if they miss a payment or if they don't take care of the house, they are at risk of losing up to 90% of their original down payment and their option credits. And I've never had to enforce that. I never want to enforce that, but it's in the contract because there needs to be motivation and skin in the game from that tenant buyer. They need to know that, hey, this is a real legal contract. I'm obligated to make my payments. And truthfully, it's no different than if you own a house. If you miss a payment to the bank, you miss one, two, three payments, they will foreclose on you, right? They will come and take your property. They'll
Yeah.
completely destroy your credit, and you will likely never be able to buy a house again, right? So I'm not as severe as the bank, but I do have investors that expect to get their monthly cash flow. As an operator, I expect predictability, I expect stability. I'm offering it to you, and I expect the same in return. So again, I'm not trying to scare anyone. It's just more, hey, this is not just do as you wish. Like, there is some teeth behind the contract. Again, don't want to enforce it. I've never had to. But if something goes wrong, like, that is the worst case scenario. But again, there's flexibility on how we deal with things. It really depends on if this is a good tenant and they just run into kind of a stumbling block, they lost their job, or something happened that's legit out of their control. I will do my best to work with them over, like, we have 3 years to fix this, right? So I'll do my best to work with them to find a solution and
Nice.
get them
That's
back on track.
absolutely amazing to hear. You really do take every little precaution that you can and make sure you mitigate as much risk as you can. And you're so understanding with, dealing with human beings who are going through their own scenarios and just really making it work to the best of your ability. And that's one thing I really appreciate. And I feel so comfortable sending my clients over to you for when I feel they're a good fit, because I know you're there to take good care of them and make sure they're getting into a home at the end of the 3 years.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Brian. And the clients you've sent have been, like, really good profiles, right? So every family you've sent, they have great incomes. Some of them are new Canadians, others are just young couples. But like, they're the right fit because the incomes are there, the motivation is there. Um, all of them have had solid credit, but all of them
Yeah.
need time with the savings. And when they see it, sort of, hey, here's the plan, and it's a structured plan, and we've got freedom to live in the house as we wish. We get to choose our own house. They get excited by that, and it's, as you know, like, having an excited client who can succeed is awesome. And then once you get to the finish line and they have succeeded, like, it's high fives all around. Everyone's just really happy because we all got what we wanted at the end
And
of the
where do you
deal.
see rent to grow homes going in the next 5 years?
That's a good question. And I need to do some 5-year planning. Honestly, I'm not trying to be a massive business. Um, I've been sort of very intentional about only doing 5 to 10 deals a year, because right now it's myself, and then I've got some partners. I've got sort of a contractor, I've got my inspector, lawyer, all that stuff. But I'm not trying to do 100 deals because I think there's too much risk of things going wrong. I think I mentioned to you, tenant screening is by far the most important thing I do. And if all of a sudden my goal is 100 deals, I honestly fear that I might get 5% of those wrong. But if I screw up 5 of those tenant screenings, I've got 5 angry investors. And those
Yeah.
investors trust me. They either know me personally, or they came through a referral, or again, my reputation's on the line because I'm not a big corporation. So I would much rather do things carefully and scale, let's say 20, 30% a year. In terms of in 5 years, I expect I'll still be doing this to some degree because I really enjoy it. But maybe we're in new markets. Maybe we look to go outside Ontario. So I need to do some serious 5-year planning. But honestly, I'm really happy doing what I do right now. And I'm happy just sort of slowly growing at a reasonable pace that ensures everything is
Nice. Yeah.
smooth and
I'm glad
successful.
that you're not looking to scale outside your means and keeping it really within control, because control at the end of the day will decide a successful business, right?
Yep, exactly. Yeah, so I know there's, like, digital, if you think about these, like, entrepreneur kind of businesses where the goal is to get as many subscribers or as much revenue up front and then sell to something large, right? Like, and I know there's a rent-owned company in the States that just got acquired for a lot of money. And they are a much more sort of, they're much more digital, automated type of outfit. I find that the value I bring is the conversations that I have in the teaching and sort of the mentorship and the guiding, right? A lot of people are not financially educated. Brian, you and I have talked about this, right? Like, this is stuff we wish was taught in schools. How to maintain your credit, like, how to save more money, how to budget, like, all these sort of life skills around money. We wish people were taught this, but a lot of people weren't. And it depends on whether your parents were savers or not. My parents were, and they were very hard on us in terms of money doesn't grow on trees and all of those old expressions. But I've worked with a lot of tenant buyers where they weren't taught really financial savvy by their parents. And so part of what I need to do often is just have a half-hour session. Sometimes I'll send them Richard's book on credit. And I know that even though of every 100 tenant buyers I talk to, maybe only 5 are good fits. Of those other 95, I'm hoping I can add value somehow by just pointing them in the right direction, or just giving them some tidbit on their next step to
Yeah.
erase a debt or call the collections company or start a savings account where you automatically just put money into it, don't think about it, right? There's a lot of tips and tricks that can get people in the right step. So I'm trying to share those in my conversations, even if I can't work with
Nice.
them
Yeah,
right
that's
now as a
that's
tenant buyer.
absolutely amazing. And I really appreciate the work you're doing. It's along the lines of what I'm trying to display as well, of teaching financial literacy and making sure people are knowing how to uphold their finances throughout life. So I really appreciate the work that you're doing. And I really appreciate that you came on the podcast as well. If anyone's looking for more information on rent to grow homes or looking to contact you, where could we find you?
Sure. So I'm on Facebook, Instagram. It's Rent to Grow Homes. Also, renttogrowhomes.com. I will be getting a TikTok account fairly soon. Brian, I'll probably need to
That's fair.
pick your brain on the best way to get that set up.
I
Because
am.
I know you're all over.
Yeah.
I know you're all over that. I'm a little bit past that age bracket, but I know a lot of my tenant buyers are there, and I need to fish where the fish are. So yeah, I probably will pick your brain on TikTok. But yeah, renttogrowhomes.com. And there's forums there that get to me directly, and I'm pretty responsive. So yeah, I'd be happy to talk to tenant buyers, investors, or anyone just interested in the program. There's
All right,
plenty
awesome.
that
Thank
I
you
can
so much
share.
for that. And if anyone has any questions as well and don't know how to reach David, I am also pretty well versed in rent to grow homes as well. I'd be happy to connect you with David if you have all my contacts. And thank you for listening to this episode of Business Beyond. If you liked this episode, please leave us a review and we'll catch you on the next episode.